Trade policy has been a central consideration of nations and kingdoms since antiquity, and the balance of making things yourself versus trading with another is a constantly changing equilibrium that markets have to deal with. But should the government be sticking its hands into the mix and influencing the market? Traditionally, government-imposed tariffs aim to achieve one of three goals: to raise revenue, protect domestic producers, or achieve reciprocity through agreements that reduce trade barriers. So there are reasons why tariffs have been and can be used in productive ways. But there are also costs and unforeseen effects to everything. In the second Trump administration, a renewed emphasis on tariffs as an economic tool has come back in a way we really haven't seen since the Great Depression. And we've seen both positive and negative effects of his tariff policy. But the question is, do the positives outweigh the negatives? Let's take a quick look into the history of U.S. tariff policy. In the early years after the Revolution, all the way up to the beginning of the 20th century, tariffs were the country's primary source of revenue. And that was really the case until the creation of income tax. But prominent figures like Alexander Hamilton made it clear that tariffs were just as much to protect and nurture budding U.S. industrial bases and prevent dependency on European goods. The same argument was used to protect the steel industry after the Civil War, and with the vast expansion of the railroad system, a symbiotic relationship between tariffs, the steel industry, and railroad expansion made convenient circumstances for the time. However, even then, free trade advocates continue to argue that tariffs stifled competition and innovation, while protectionists maintained that they were essential for a robust domestic economy. But the debate was largely put on hold until the immediate negative repercussions of the Smoot-Hawley Act in 1930, which exacerbated the already dire economic conditions of the Great Depression. The tariffs, which focused heavily on agriculture, forced our largest trading partners like Canada, Britain, and France, among others, to retaliate with their own tariffs, leading to a sharp decline in global trade. As trade barriers rose, international commerce shrank, deepening the economic crisis. In response, Congress passed the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934, and from then up to 2016, the primary goal of U.S. trade policy was to reach agreements with other countries and promote integration. The election and re-election of Donald Trump has revitalized the protectionist instincts of many Americans. And after decades of watching industries move out of the country, mostly to Central America or Southeast Asia, I get the longing for the industry that existed while the U.S. was performing better economically. However, we run into a potential correlation versus causation problem in this estimation. Were these industries the reason for our economic success in the latter half of the 20th century, or was it simply the most efficient mechanism of our economy at the time when a post-war boom and rise to the global hegemon brought us to be the economic powerhouse that we've become? If they're the cause, then the reindustrialized vision of the Trump administration makes sense. But if they're just what made sense for our economy at the time, and the shift to be a more service-based economy is what's best for us now, then artificially forcing us backwards is not going to have the effect proponents of Maganomics want them to have. If industries are dying in a free market, they're generally dying for a reason, and putting naturally dying industries on government life support does not make for efficient markets. Now, I think there are certain industries and supply chains that are worth protecting, mostly having to do with defense and national security, especially when many of those products would otherwise come from adversaries. Industries like tech, oil and gas, steel, and chemicals are crucial. So does that mean we should tariff these industries and make sure we can produce what we need should a world war or some other conflict begin? I would still generally say no. The reason is that many of these are imported from allies. The vast majority of our steel imports are from Canada, Mexico, and Brazil. And if a global conflict happened now, even with Brazil as a member of BRICS, I don't think that these nations would cut us off from their steel. It'd actually probably up their production knowing how crucial it is. Same with oil and gas. While we're a net exporter of refined products, we import significantly more crude oil than we produce. But the vast majority comes from Canada, Mexico, and other South and Central American countries. Now where it gets more dicey is in tech and chemicals, which we're much more reliant on Chinese production for. According to Healthcare Without Harm Europe, 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredient imports to Europe come from China. And in a statement before the Congressional Committee on Ways and Means, Stephen Schondelmeyer, professor of pharmaceutical management and economics at the University of Minnesota and director of Prime Institute, said that 46% of generic APIs imported to the U.S. were either directly from China or from Chinese supply chains through Indian businesses. If a conflict were to cease these supply chains, serious problems would arise. So maybe tariffs in the name of national security could do a few things. 1, build up more domestic manufacturing, and 2, incentivize more friendly nations to ramp up their production to meet new demands. A third could basically be behavior modification. If China continues to behave aggressively in the South China Sea, then starving their economy via high tariffs could force change if implemented correctly. Same with Mexico for not cracking down on cartels and illegal immigration. Kind of a sanction light, you could say, although tariffs and sanctions are obviously quite different overall. Another potential positive to targeted tariffs is driving industry out of adversarial countries to more friendly ones. Businesses are smart, and industries have been moving out of China to places like Vietnam, India, and Thailand to reduce geopolitical and supply chain risk. There might be some reason to believe that tariffs influence companies to bring industry back to the US as well. Nvidia committed $500 billion to AI and tech infrastructure stateside, at least partially due to the 32% tariffs placed on Taiwanese goods. A private joint venture known as Stargate pledged to invest $500 billion for infrastructure also tied to AI development, and will include tech firms OpenAI, Oracle, and SoftBank. And drug manufacturer Merck plans to invest $70 billion to produce pharmaceuticals in the US. Now, were these decisions solely due to tariffs or pressure from Trump and his administration? Probably not, but they were certainly a factor. One of the main purposes that people claim Trump is using his tariff threats for is lowering the tariffs against us. And that theoretically could be a good use as the most powerful economy in the world. Going to nations with tariffs placed on us and saying that if they don't lower those tariffs, then we'll place our own on them could be a very good thing if it works. However, not only do tariffs generally impact the larger economy more, there's no real evidence to suggest that this has ever accomplished its goal. Many times, placing tariffs on countries forces them to raise theirs, like I mentioned with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, or like we've seen more recently with Canada. I'm all for greater free trade, and if the way to lower global barriers is to threaten tariffs, then I'd love to see it work out. But the brash and constantly flip-flopping way Trump and his administration have conducted their trade policy has thrown the market into chaos. And that's just not good for anyone, except those with possible insider information. Investors don't invest in volatile markets. Consumers preemptively buy things they believe might soon be tariffed, and businesses scramble to find new suppliers for imported materials, all to be psyched out by yet another delay in tariff hikes. Tariffs can also push trading partners to look for other consumers as well, like we're seeing some Southeast Asian countries reorient towards China amidst the Trump trade war. One externality people rarely think about when it comes to import tariffs is how it affects exporters and business costs overall. One way tariffs affect the business market is by driving entrepreneurs towards the protected industries and away from their current one. If we place tariffs on foreign vehicles, then more investment will obviously be put into domestic vehicle manufacturing and maintenance. But this could take investment, resources, and jobs away from other industries like aircraft manufacturing and maintenance. This leads to a shortage in the aviation industry, which, as you can imagine, comes with serious risks. Another problem with indiscriminate tariffs is the fact that many domestic manufacturers import their materials. If tariffs raise the cost of intermediate goods, then higher costs to businesses lower production and employment. And depending on the degree of the tariff, could completely negate the point of protectionism. The problem for exporters is partially that when domestic production and consumption increase, the dollar often appreciates. This means foreign markets have reduced buying power and buy fewer American products. And the other problem for exporters are retaliatory tariffs, which is a pretty self-explanatory problem we've seen before and I mentioned earlier. The point is that prices don't only rise after tariffs are placed because of the tax itself, but also because of rising business costs due to higher priced intermediate goods, redirected domestic investment, and supply chain issues. Tariffs are a tricky tool for any country to use effectively, and while I'm largely against the government intervening in the market, there are some cases where costs might be worth the geopolitical benefits, but only if the tariffs are specifically targeted and well communicated to the market, avoiding confusion and volatility. As we see today, the Trump tariffs have been a bit of a mixed bag, and we've yet to see the real economic ramifications of whatever final economic landscape we find ourselves in when the dust settles. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think the US should do in terms of tariff policy. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.